I thought I'd just start with giving you a description and the link to my course. Saqib, as you mentioned, you've taken this course before. I also held this course in 2020, the last time around, and I'm going to hold it in the spring of 2023. And for every spring for the next 4 years, I'm going to hold it at Oslo Metropolitan University. It is going to be an international course with some exchange students coming in, which is really great, of course, because this is a topic that is really interesting to discuss across border. So I just thought I'd put up the brief explanation of the course itself, as it reads on the webpage. You can see the link downstairs. It's really, I wrote this kind of 3 years ago. So it reads that climate change and the environment are closing in on society in both space and time, becoming a relevant dimension of ever more areas of life. Significant transformation need to take place over the next decade, and here journalism will have a key role to play. This course will help students pursue both the theoretical and practical development of climate journalism, including the understanding of its own role in society in a time of declared and perceived risk. And of course, you're already going straight into that last bit here about the own role, advocacy journalism, as it was commented, and so on, the role, the norms of the journalist itself. That is part and parcel of this course and part and parcel of the challenges of climate journalism, I mean, more generally, I think. But I thought I'd just kind of link up this. I mean, I started having courses in climate journalism about 9 years ago. But I think it's safe to say that within the Norwegian context, some of the things that we've been discussing in these courses has most definitely also been taken up by the practice of climate journalism itself. So this is an interview in the paper called Journalisten, which is a newspaper for journalists. And it's about a year old ago, and it explains how the public broadcaster NRK, how their new climate editorial board works, because they reorganized their climate journalism 2.5 years ago, and are now dedicating more resources to the coverage of climate change, and also changing, I think, their approach to climate change. And one of the things that they said was that, precisely as I put it in my course, that the crisis is becoming more concrete in people's lives. So I think there's a clear link here between what we as lecturers think of as important in theory for what climate journalism is about, and the way that climate journalism is developing itself. One of the journalists, the editor, in fact, also said that we are going through a green shift anyhow, he said in the interview, pointing to the fact that Norway, as an oil exporting nation, at some point needs to have a green shift. Just a few weeks ago, the government that we're having under pressure from the Socialist Left Party decided to put a moratorium on the search for more and new oil fields in the Arctic, which is a reflection of that this sense of inevitability. There's a green shift happening, and this is something that journalism needs to relate to. And even before that, there was a clear link, in fact, an explicit link between the things that we've been saying at Oslo Met, Elizabeth and I, and others that have been having this course, and the editor of this public broadcast. This is Ytterstad, who first interviewed me. Well, first the journalist interviewed me about the climate journalism, and then they referred to that interview when they discussed with her, and she says that climate journal, and I first said that climate journalism should be more about how society changes, and Romet agrees, even saying that the NRK's wager on climate journalism is an answer to precisely that. The natural sciences are important, but we need to move on and look at what society does. So this focus on society is also a focus that I'll be having in this talk. So let me just give you, as I'm planning now, the next cohort of students coming in from, I think, Tanzania, Uganda. I hope Elizabeth can have some Indonesians coming here as well, and also some students from Europe will, together with Norwegian students, take this course. And as I'm planning it, I think it's clearer to see that there are four main kind of theoretical threads in my approach to climate journalism. First of all, and not surprisingly, it's the natural sciences and the understanding of the climate crisis itself. I mean, I think this is a very important part of it, and perhaps it's the most obvious place to start, I guess, in any country of the world where there was a course on climate journalism. The science of climate change itself will need to be addressed. Now, this year, I'm going to also link this more. I'm going to have a speaker from the International Panel on Biodiversity, Vigdis Vanvik, come as well, because I think that in Norway and I think elsewhere as well, the links between the climate crisis and the relationships and sometimes the conflict with what is sometimes called the nature crisis, biodiversity I mentioned already, is getting more clear. So there needs to be a theoretical input and an understanding of what the climate crisis is, what global warming is in. So that's one aspect. The second aspect, which has been addressed also for some years, is what we can call perhaps climate communication and psychology. And here our attention is no longer on the natural facts, if you like, of the changes of the climate, the floods, the extreme weather, and so on, but to our brains, how we as human beings cope with, understand climate change. I mean, there are all kinds of theoretical aspects related to this. Should we be optimistic about it? Should we be pessimistic about it? Is the human brain construed in a way that we can only deal with short-time challenges and we cannot really deal with climate change? Climate change is a long-term process and so on. I mean, there's a whole host of problematics connected to this. And one famous Norwegian climate psychologist has written, Per Espen Stoknes, and has often attended the course. He has written a book about what we think about when we try not to think about global warming or climate change. I mean, so it's really about our brains, and this is of course relevant for how journalists and others try to communicate climate change in an efficient way. And then there's the part that I'm highlighting more and more, which is climate change is a societal problem. I think in between the natural scientific discussions and the climate communications and discussions, there has not been sufficient attention on how climate change is so ingrained with the way we organize our society, the way power is organized in our society, and the injustices inherent to climate change itself is exasperated by the injustices within society. So I'm focusing more on the justice aspects than before. And finally, and I won't go that much into this in this talk, and I understand you've already dealt with it a little bit, there needs to be a reflection on climate journalism as a field and practice in its own right. And here the question of the roles and the values of the journalists is very important. But let's focus on the justice, as I said I would. I mean, this is not just something that I talk about in theory. I mean, I've inhaled this thing as well. But let me first give the quote here. I think there are many reasons why foregrounding questions of climate justice is important. But this is just a quote from Shane Gunster, one of the authors of the book Journalism and the Climate Crisis from 2017. And he writes that foregrounding questions of climate justice could motivate and empower journalists to explore a broader range of questions and perspectives about climate change and provide an abundance of resources for audiences to conceptualize the issue in novel ways. And earlier this year, I completed a podcast called, well, that is in Norwegian, but it translates into English, Straight Ahead, Hunting for the Just Climate Solution. So I did this with Ingrid Salvesen, who's coming in as a PhD student in climate journalism on the 1st of January this year, and who's helping me with the development of the new kind of climate journalism course that we're having in March. So climate justice is something that I've been working with as a little bit as a journalist myself, but I also think that scholars are pointing to the need to have more focus on justice aspects in their coverage of climate change. And this is not just me. I think there's a general kind of turn in society where the emphasis on justice aspects is coming from the most unlikely quarters. This is the Norwegian king in his traditional opening of Parliament just a few months ago. He addressed and he spoke explicitly about the government, who is now setting up a committee on just transition. How can we have a just transition in a country like Norway, dependent upon oil and gas exports? And he ended, I think, one of his statements, coming out of the crisis-ridden Europe with the pandemic and now the war and so on. He said that we must make the right choices to keep our common values, strengthen peace and solidarity in the world, and contribute to a peaceful Europe, to continue being a world-leading energy nation and contribute to emission cuts. So in that little sentence, you have the entire idea of Norway being both a force for good, but also being a world-leading energy nation. He says energy nation. He doesn't say fossil fuel nation. So in between those lines, you can read some of the contradictions that we have in Norwegian society. But the most important thing is the last bit here, and to come out of this period with strong social bonds by way of reduced social and geographic differences. So this idea that there needs to be change, we need to come out of this in a way that reduces or at least does not exacerbate injustices is part of public discourse as well, and not just in Norway. I think there was an election campaign in Sweden and in Denmark earlier this fall, and they both kind of had quite a bit of discussion about justice and climate change. And I even made a search in the Norwegian newspaper archive to see how newspaper coverage of climate change increasingly is also focusing on justice. So here I had a search strings with climate and justice. And as you can see here in 2018, it was about 2,500 mentions of climate and justice in the same newspaper story. That exploded and more than doubled in 2019, not unsurprisingly, perhaps, given the emergence of the school strikes and the focus on climate change there. But I think more surprisingly, it dipped a bit in 2020, but then it increased even more in 2021, up to 8,000. So I think that in various ways, justice is being emphasized more in discussions of climate change. So that was the general kind of layout of the theory and practice of climate change. I thought that I'd now turn to two challenges, if you like, which I think that I thought was perhaps relevant to talk to you about today. I think this is a challenge for both the theory and practice of climate journalism, but perhaps the first one here, global or local approach to climate journalism, is the most important theoretical question. And then I think for the practice of journalism, or climate journalism, whether to consider climate change an issue or a dimension of other issues is a key challenge. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about both. First of all, the global aspect here. I mentioned to you my PhD student, Ingrid Salvesen. As we were preparing the course this March, she recommended this book to me that I read, and I'm passing on the recommendations to you. It's called Global Warming and the Sweetness of Life, a tar sands tale. And it's written by two journalists and academics. It's an interesting book because in a way it is both, it's an example of both climate journalism as practice. They go to visit the indigenous communities in the Alberta region of Canada, and they also go to the big oil producing area of Alberta in Fort McMurray, talking to oil workers, people who live off extracting oil from the tar sands in Alberta in Canada, which is one of the dirtiest way of extracting oil in the world, which increases also the total amount of emissions to the atmosphere. But this is a really interesting book, which is both a reportage of their journey, but then it goes into theoretical discussions about degrowth, about development issues. They interview the architect of the initiative in Ecuador, trying to limit oil production in the Yazuni rainforest, and the failed attempt to have the West pay for to Ecuador to leave some of the oil in the ground, but it was a very inspirational way of approaching climate justice. So this is a good book. But one of what I wanted to emphasize to you now is that the title, global warming. When we talk about climate change, the one obvious reason why we should have a global approach to climate change is that it is really global warming. It is a global phenomenon that can only really be addressed at a global level. And I think they have some good argument to say that climate change is a more inclusive evocation that can get its arms around the global weirding of the contemporary climate. And as they say, we sympathize with its use, but climate change is really just global warming with all the rough edges sanded off, a move to more depoliticized and unfocused narratives. So there's something to be said for this older term, global warming, because that is actually the best description of what is happening at the global level. It's not climate change in any vague sense of the word, but it is a specific rise in global median temperature, which is increasingly causing havoc, as you so well know in Pakistan as well. So this is a very strong argument, I think, to emphasize the global aspects of it. That does not take away the need to localize and to make the climate change coverage relevant in local context. But remembering the global is very important, just for the sake that it is global warming that we're talking about. And also, I think it is very important to emphasize this when it comes to mitigation of climate change. So this is a quote. This is I've just taken a photograph from one other book that I'd recommend to you. By a friend of mine called Jonathan Neal, called Fight the Fire, Green New Deals and Global Climate Jobs. And he has 4 chapters on the relationship between the global north and the global south when it comes to total emissions cuts. And and his point is really, really simple, which is that there is no way we will have 80% cuts in global emissions. And that is what is required. That is what is required to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. There's no way we can do that if we only cut emissions in the global north. Certainly, there needs to be more cuts in the global north. The rich north emissions are about 40% of the global average. You have to basically, if you cut all of them, that is 40% of the global total. But and if you want to have the global south emissions, which now accounts for 60% of world emissions, and you cannot cut all of that, so you could cut perhaps 2/3 of them, then you will come to the kind of 80% cuts that is necessary. So this simple graph illustrates why it's very important to emphasize the need for emission cuts, both in the global north and in the global south. And I mention also this in particular because I don't know how the coverage of the last climate coverage was in Pakistan, but here in Norway, both from journalists and from some of my environmental friends, they were very happy. And to a certain extent, I understand that there was a reason to be happy for this new fund of loss and damage, which means that some of the disasters that are unfolding with greater speed and with more dire consequences in the global south, that there should be a fund and there should be some sort of reparations from the rich north that has been contributed most historically to climate change and to global warming. But I think that if we imagine for 1 second that as the Norwegian editorial, there was the biggest Norwegian paper, VG, they wrote a horrible editorial after this summit when they said that, well, the meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh was brilliant because now we can turn our heads away from the need to cut emissions a bit and focus more on reparation and loss and damage. And there were some scientists answering that editorial saying that this is a very dangerous way of thinking about it, because if you think that you can only adapt to climate change without cutting the emissions, that creates a false sense of security, because the global warming will press ahead and the consequences will be far too great to have some sort of reparation for it. So the need for a global orientation to the theory and practice of climate change, I think, is important, not only in the recognition of the problem itself, but also in the way we go about discussing the policy to address climate change and the need to cut emission drastically, as the school strikers emphasized. So that's the global versus the local. Now, as for the second challenge, is climate change an issue, a separate issue? Or is it, as the Norwegian Prime Minister Ytterstad likes to say oftentimes, a frame around everything, or a dimension of pretty much everything? A dimension of the economy, a dimension of the politics, a dimension of the nature itself. I'm inclined towards seeing it as both. And I'm introducing my porch here as a way of illustrating this. So this is a photo taken of my backyard and also of my porch. You cannot see it very well in the second picture, but my porch is leaning down into the forest, because after the big drought in 2018 in Norway, this crack in my lawn appeared. And it made my porch lean towards the forest, and we always had to tell our neighbors that be careful, we can just slide into the forest because the porch is not good. And so we had to go approach the previous owner who had built this earth foundation on which the porch is standing, and we said that, well, you should pay for this. You did a bad job. This was not a good job. Our porch is leaning into the forest. So that was our argument, with our lawyers and everything. And then the previous owner said that, no, this has nothing to do with the job that my client was doing. This is climate change. This is the drought that is just changing the earth, and that means that your porch is leaning, and so on. So in a very normal kind of quarrel between a previous owner of a house and the current one, climate change came into the picture. And it illustrates how things that supposedly is not about climate change is increasingly being linked to climate change. And that's what I mean by climate change is a dimension. Whether it's a relevant dimension, whether it's an important dimension of the different issues that we can have is another story. But just to think of it that way, I think is useful. And my friend Thorsten Schäfer from Germany, he often uses the metaphor for climate journalism that to write about or to cover climate change, you have to think about a house that has a front yard and a backyard. And the front yard might often be other interesting things that is happening that will entice the reader and the viewer to be interested in the story. But then as you pull people within the front yard, and they get to see the house, and they get to see they're interested in everything that's going on there, you lead them towards the backyard. And then the backyard is climate change. The backyard is the context in which all these interesting or problematic things are happening. So oftentimes, and this is also something that, for instance, the climate editorial board of NDRK, I'm thinking, they very consciously, and they have said this in interviews, they don't necessarily talk much about climate change, but they they kind of invite you to think about climate change indirectly by stories that are supposedly about something else than climate change. So this is, in one sense, I think, is a very positive development, but it is a challenge as well, because if climate change is just kind of mentioned and it's not highlighted as the key thing, then it can become almost trivial. I mean, there's a current energy crisis in Europe. Of course, there's the war in Europe, and sometimes you'll see mentions of climate change. But does climate change really shape and frame and put limits to what happens in other areas of life? That's a more difficult one. I mean, to use that metaphor of the Norwegian Prime Minister, if climate change is a frame around everything, what kind of frame is it? Is it an ornamental frame? Is it just that we should think about this green thing? I mean, you've probably heard about this phenomenon of greenwashing, that we kind of just talk about green stuff, but it's not really green at all. Is that the kind of frame that we're talking about? Or are we talking about the active verb of to frame, to set limits on oil production, on domestic flying? I mean, if it is a frame around everything that is the key issue, that is very, very important, then it should also mean that other concerns needs to become at the second level. I mean, this is the only way we can really think about something as a crisis. I mean, during the pandemic, there were so many countries around the world, including Norway, who just made immediate decisions to address the primary crisis, which was the pandemic at the time. And that kind of policy that does not just talk about climate change as something that is in the background as a dimension, but as something that is so important and so vital and so determining of other parts of our society, that it leads to very rapid, concrete crisis solutions. That's a different issue. So I think there needs to be some thinking within climate journalism whether to use climate change as a separate issue, single it out as a separate issue, or whether to have it a dimension and think about the ways in which it is combined. So provisionally, as my conclusion here, I'll just leave you with a quote by Mark Shapiro, who is the head of the Earth Journalism Network at Berkeley in California. And this emphasizes both the global point that I've been addressing here, but also how there are so many stories of justice and injustice waiting to be made if we focus in our coverage of climate change on the societal aspects of it. He writes how climate change illuminates the fundamental forces shaping our society, who has power and who does not, who gets hit first by the degradation underway, and conversely, who gets access to the ecological benefits, and who is last in line for them. So I think I'll leave you with that, and I'm happy to hear your comments or questions or whatever. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Andreas, for your useful presentation. You talked about your course, the theoretical aspect and practical aspect of the course. I'm sure we're going to have a discussion on that. We have a separate time for that, and then we're going to have comments and other questions.